Is Rick Warren doing okay? He hasn't been the same since April 5, 2013, when he experienced the most devastating catastrophe of his life, and it now appears that his situation may worsen. This is the story of how a family's tragedy turned into a crusade, and how sadness never truly goes away, no matter how strong your faith is. This is the aspect of Rick Warren that most people find most confusing. The world had already witnessed him break on national television before his unending agony finally broke him. Rick had already experienced the agony of being publicly torn apart. Rick's name became a lightning rod back in 2006 when Saddleback was growing rapidly. He became well known as a result of his development, but he was also targeted. Many churches disagreed with the purpose-driven growth paradigm that Rick outlined. However, even he was unable to foresee what would happen next. Because they attempted to adopt his tactics, congregations all over America broke apart. Friendships ending in parking lot arguments over worship styles and seating arrangements, churches splitting apart, and members being expelled. Rick detested that. He pleaded with pastors to refrain from using force, expelling people, or treating development like a battle. However, the harm still occurred. Additionally, Rick felt accountable each time a church used his playbook to tear itself apart. Imagine bearing the burden of knowing that something you made broke hundreds apart and helped thousands flourish. Then, he became worse. Rick entered an unexpected storm in 2008. Barack Obama requested him to say the inauguration prayer after he was elected. It ought to have been a privilege. Rather, it turned into a national scandal. People discovered a letter he had written to his own congregation, expressing his own conviction that a man and a woman should only be married in accordance with the Bible. The consequences weren't pleasant either. Once a best-selling pastor, Rick Warren is now the target of hate speech accusations, headlines, protests, and calls to be removed from the inauguration. The irony, he had been working with homosexual men and women in his church's AIDS ministry, hugging HIV patients, and telling reporters he had genuine friendships in the LGBTQ community 6 months prior. However, none of that was important. America desired a villain. Obama spoke up for him, claiming that disagreement was not hate and that Rick had embraced him at Saddleback despite their differences. Nevertheless, the blowback was fierce. Strangest of all, he was attacked by many fellow evangelicals for the exact opposite reason. While one group asked that he apologize, they claimed that he lacked the necessary savagery, militancy, and anger. As he observed them, Rick pondered how battling individuals could possibly get them nearer to Jesus. He lost someone, regardless of what he said. Someone always called him a coward, regardless of what he did. That was not the end of it. Accusations kept coming in. Both in 2009 and 2012, Rick received criticism from evangelical pastors for attending ecumenical conferences on poverty, suffering around the world, and peace, as well as for dining with Muslims and imams. Because Jesus was a friend to everyone, he spoke of being a friend to everyone. However, that straightforward notion of friendship sparked yet another wave of indignation, compromise, deceit, and treachery. The remarks were hurled like stones at him. Rick was accused of burning a bridge each time he attempted to construct one, but he was accustomed to debate, criticism, and waking up to find that his character had been determined by strangers. However, none of it had prepared him for the subsequent agony. When Matthew Warren was diagnosed, he was 7 years old. Clinical depredation. The physician said that Rick and Kay had scion. Warren was unable to fully comprehend it. They witnessed that kind of depravity in a child who was hardly old enough to tie his own shoes. From the very beginning, when Matthew was only a child, there were indications. There was a problem. There was something in the wiring of his lovely, brilliant intellect that made everything seem heavier, harsher, and sharper than it should have. He was the type of child who could locate the person in pain as soon as he entered a room. Perhaps because he understood other people's suffering, the same agony that inhabited him each day. Friends recall Matthew belittling anyone who appeared uneasy or disoriented in a crowd during events. He was gifted with a sense of human pain. Doesn't the irony pierce deeply? On his own, the youngster who sensed the darkness of everyone else was drowning. Later, Rick Warren would characterize his son as a young man with a sharp mind and a kind heart that comforted countless people. He was also extremely kind, sensitive, and empathetic. However, that is the public persona that Matthew displayed to the world. The Warren family was leading a separate life behind closed doors. Endless doctor's appointments, drugs that didn't work despite promising relief, sessions of therapy that resembled tossing stones into the sea, observing their son battle severe depressions that engulfed him year after year, panic episodes that appeared suddenly. His demeanor was completely transformed by mood swings. They made every effort. The best doctors in America, Rick said. The most cutting-edge therapies, therapists, and prayers from thousands of individuals worldwide who were unaware of Matthew's name. Warren kept his sickness a secret, not because he was ashamed, but rather because he needed to preserve his dignity and share his tale. When your own son asks you why he can't just die, how do you respond to the millions of people who read your books and your big church congregation? Because Matthew asked his father that question. Sitting across from Rick at the age of 17, the child gave him a look and said something that would haunt the pastor for the rest of his life. He informed his father that it was brutally clear that he would not be cured. They had seen some of the country's top physicians. The best medication had been taken by him. They had tried every strategy imaginable, but nothing had worked. The question that no parent should ever have to hear was what Matthew asked his father. Why can't I simply pass away and enter paradise? Rick told him that he had to persevere. As a father, he had to think that there might be a solution out there. They had not yet tried some of the treatments. There will soon be a breakthrough. After that chat, Matthew lived for an additional 10 years. For 10 years, he tried, hoped, and woke up each morning with the same unrelenting ache that was like barbed wire around his brain. However, this is what Rick Warren instinctively knew. He knew something terrible was about to happen, even if he couldn't say it aloud. Identify it as intuition. Describe it as a father's fear, whatever you want to call it. He was aware that Matthew's suffering would eventually become unbearable, perhaps even soon, and that information weighed down and chilled him like a stone in his chest. Each and every day, the Warren family enjoyed a great time together on April 5. That's why it's so terrible. They laughed, chatted, and spent time together as a family. Everything appeared to be all right. Matthew appeared to be doing well. Depression, however, lies. It informs you that there is no hope, no relief, and no way out. And Matthew returned home to his Mission Viejo house in what Rick would later describe as a brief wave of melancholy. Around 10 in the morning, he made a choice that would tear his family apart that Friday morning. He shot himself. It was an afternoon call. Due to a self-inflicted gunshot wound, Matthew was discovered dead at his house. The serial number of the unregistered firearm, which he had unlawfully purchased online, was rubbed out. Matthew had managed to get around the laws requiring background checks and gun registration in California. Subsequently, Rick would tweet about the individual who sold his son that gun, claiming to have forgiven them and quoting Matthew 6:15, which states that you must forgive others in order for God to forgive you. However, there was no theology, no forgiveness, and no purpose that Friday, merely a parent who had to identify the body of his son. After receiving the news, Rick and Kay's little group arrived in less than 30 minutes. They didn't wait for approval, call, or SMS. They simply appeared on the pavement, encircled the Warren with their arms, and remained motionless. Later, Rick would explain, "You need fewer words the more deeply you're hurting." His tiny company slept on kitchen sofas that night, wherever there was room in the Warren house. They didn't do what they said. "We're not leaving you alone." Rick wrote to his Saddleback Church congregation the following day. He told them the truth after serving as their pastor for 33 years, supporting them at funerals and holding their hands at every possible crisis. "The agonized agony we are experiencing at the moment is beyond words," he added. He described Matthew's kindness, compassion, and brilliant mind, but he also said what needed to be said, that even with America's best doctors, best medications, and best prayers, the torture of mental illness never went away. The media exploded as our youngest son, Matthew 27, passed away today. Matthew had been a lifelong member of Saddleback. The irony of Rick Warren, the purpose-driven pastor, losing his son to suicide was too much for some people to handle. How could the man who gave millions of people a sense of purpose in life fail to save his own child? The criticism was harsh and quick, with some questioning his faith and others suggesting that this was God's judgment. Rick ignored the majority of it. However, the burden of public grieving differs from that of private mourning. Everyone wanted to share in Rick's suffering, comprehend it, analyze it, and use it to support their arguments. However, Rick had other worries, such as organizing a funeral that was unable to take place because Orange County lacked a large enough venue to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. In order to honor Matthew's memory, the Warren family decided to hold a private memorial service for only his family. Instead, they asked people to donate to the Matthew Warren Fund for Mental Health, and the checks began coming in by the thousands. Rick stepped away from the pulpit at Saddlebah for 4 months, or 16 weeks of deliberate silence. He spent his days by himself with Kay and God, letting other pastors cover for him. It changes you, Rick said, when you spend that much time in serious conversation with the Almighty. And it did. By the time he returned in late July, standing in front of his congregation for the first time since Matthew's death, Rick had changed. He no longer merely sympathized, but now felt people's pain more deeply and cried easily. Rick talked about grief as God's gift and how we move through loss. The sermon that day was about getting through what you're going through. The topic had been chosen weeks before Matthew's suicide, a cosmic coincidence that felt almost cruel. He sympathized because he now knew what it was like to bury your child. As he sobbed on stage, Kay stood next to him and dabbed at his cheek, telling the audience that Matthew's body was broken, that the gun had broken it, but that he would be raised in glory. She talked about how she missed him and how her heart was crushed until Jesus came to get her. Her words, "It's okay to walk through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time," stopped people cold. That sermon set off a larger mental health initiative at Saddlebeach Church, which included conferences, workshops, and support groups. Rick collaborated with the Catholic Diocese of Orange, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, psychiatrists, counselors, and anyone who would listen. He began by posing the necessary question, why do we feel ashamed when our brains malfunction? There is no shame when your heart fails or when your kidneys stop functioning. He spoke candidly about Matthew, calling him brave and describing him as one of the most courageous people he had ever met for continuing to live for 10 more years after he asked why he couldn't simply die. His motto, his method of making sense of the incomprehensible, was that Matthew's life had meaning even in its brokenness, perhaps especially in its brokenness. Rick read thousands of letters from people Matthew had led to faith in Christ, and he wrote in his journal that even broken trees bear fruit in God's garden of grace. And Rick forgave not only the gun dealer, but life itself. He never doubted his belief in God, but months later, he said on CNN that he had doubts about God's plan. He acknowledged that God was good, but he clarified that not everything that occurs is God's will, because we live in a world where people have free will. Rick repeatedly referred to Matthew as brave in interviews, sermons, and private conversations with friends, saying that he couldn't hold God responsible if Matthew decided to end his own life. He had to come to terms with it, find a way to live with it, and figure out how to continue breathing when all his instincts told him to stop. Perhaps Rick was correct. Perseverance in the face of such agony is the ultimate form of courage, but this is what people failed to notice. Brave for rising every morning despite the unrelenting pain. Brave for trying one more medication, one more therapy session, one more day when everything in him screamed to quit. You don't get over losing a child, you just get through it. You may learn to carry it, but it's always there, that grief sitting in your chest like a second heart. Rick told people that he cried every single day after Matthew died. How could he have moved past it? In 2024, while still collaborating with California's Catholic bishops on a pastoral letter titled Hope and Healing, he discussed depression as a part of his preaching, incorporating it into sermons, devotionals, and interviews. He did not view this as weakness, but rather as love. He described it as a turning point, a new benchmark for mental health ministries worldwide. In 2025, Rick continued to preach, travel the world, speak at the World Evangelical Alliance in Seoul, South Korea, teach at Saddleback, and record his daily hope devotionals. His sermons, "Your chemistry is not your character, your illness is not your identity," sounded like an incantation that, if repeated enough, might heal someone else's son or daughter. In the quiet moments between sermons, conferences, and traveling the world, Rick Warren remained that father on a sidewalk in Mission Viejo. He spoke about faith, purpose, and finding meaning in suffering. He established foundations for mental health, AIDS patients, and completing the Great Commission. He and Kay lived on 9% of their income and donated 91%. They now have 5 grandchildren. And here's the terrible news that most people don't discuss. Rick Warren is still in mourning. Years later, more than 10 years later, the loss hasn't lessened, still carrying that conversation from when Matthew was 17, that question about why he couldn't just die. The pain hadn't gone away, it had simply become a part of who he was. Rick found the strength to be there for others, to hold their hands at gravesides, to tell them about God's garden of grace, where even broken trees grow fruit, but his tree is still broken and always will be. Not all wounds are healed by time, some simply become scars you learn to live with. The terrible paradox of pastoral ministry is that you give until there is nothing left, and then you give some more because people need you, and the work matters. He preaches about hope, but carries despair. He talks about God's goodness, while questioning God's plan. He helps millions find their purpose, while wondering if he could have done more to save Matthew. Rick Warren's faith did not falter. That's what he tells people and what he believes. He never doubted heaven, never questioned God's existence, and never stopped believing in the resurrection. Matthew's body was broken, but he's in glory now. Rick knows it in his bones. Because to stop would be to acknowledge that perhaps, just possibly, there is no purpose in some types of pain. The belief that he will one day see his son again, whole and healed and free from the agony that tormented him for 27 years, is what keeps Rick going. Without it, Matthew's death would have been a senseless tragedy, random suffering in a universe that doesn't care. However, the question remains, is Rick Warren really okay? He claims to be different now, changed, and more sympathetic. The polished mega-church pastor who wrote best-selling books has given way to something raw and more human. Perhaps this is growth. Perhaps it's grace, or perhaps it's just what happens when the worst thing imaginable becomes your reality. He feels people's pain in a way he never did before Matthew's death. He weeps easily. He connects with the broken and hurting because he is broken and hurting. Every Monday morning, Rick confesses, he wakes up with what he calls post-message syndrome, wondering if someone else could do a better job, wondering if he's smart enough, strong enough, and faithful enough to lead a church of tens of thousands. Despite this, Rick continues to work, preach to thousands every week, travel the world, spread the gospel, and build his empire of churches, foundations, and initiatives. He tells people that God never lets you bear more than he puts in you to bear it, that people should help each other carry each other's burdens. But what happens when your burden gets too heavy to carry? What happens when faith, medicine, prayer, and everything else you try still isn't enough? Rick doesn't have those answers. No one does. The doubt creeps in, the exhaustion, the weight of carrying everyone else's burdens while barely managing his own. All he has to do is decide whether to continue or stop, and he decides to continue. However, the cracks are visible in interviews when he breaks down in the middle of a sentence, in sermons when he needs to stop and gather himself, in tweets that are more painful than consoling, and when Kay stands next to him, wiping his tears while holding her own broken heart. The story doesn't have a tidy conclusion, no redemption arc where everything makes sense, no moment where Rick finds peace and the pain goes away. It's just a man who lost his son, who doubts God's plan while holding fast to God's goodness, who preaches hope while living with heartbreak. They're not the same people they were before April 5th, 2013. How could they be? Is Rick Warren okay? Just a parent who forgave the guy who sold his son a pistol because it's the right thing to do, even when it seems impossible.